Hello, and welcome to another segment of the Digital Indigenous Storytelling Project. Throughout this series, we'll interview Indigenous individuals who live in Missouri and have them share a story about themselves and their culture. My name is Eric Pinto. I'm Choctaw of Mississippi and Zuni of New Mexico, and a project coordinator for the Catherine M. Booter Center for American Indian Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. In this segment, I'll be interviewing Melissa Horner. Melissa, thanks for taking time out to be with us today and to share your life experiences and culture with us. Can you start us off with an introduction and background about yourself?
Sure. Tanshi Kakiao Mizami, Melissa Horner Dishinakashin. So I said, hello, my friends. My name is Melissa Horner, and that's in the Michif language. That's the language of the Métis people. And I am currently living in what's colonially known as Columbia, Missouri. But I have only been here for about 2 years. I grew up in Southwest Montana for my whole life, really, and then moved here a couple of years ago to begin a PhD program at the University of Missouri. And I'm studying sociology, and my research focus in my program is trying to basically explore the ways that Native individuals and tribal nations work to interrupt and heal intergenerational and historical trauma that's been caused by settler colonialism.
Do you see yourself with that type of, field of study, kind of creating something you're on your own, or do you want to hop on board with an organization, or what would you like to do? What's some future goals?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mostly am just sort of keeping my eyes open at this point in time. I'm also part of a fellowship program with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And so that fellowship that I'm part of focuses on this idea of building a culture of health. And so my entry point into that is through, how Indigenous people heal historical trauma. And so part of that fellowship works to help me think about what ideas might be available for research like this, because a lot of people, who get PhDs go into academia and become professors and stuff like that, which I might do. That might be something, but I'm honestly more drawn toward more community-based work and especially Native-led and run organizations that are a little bit more involved with communities rather than working at the university level. But I feel mostly just open to where the path might lead me, since I'll be in my program for another 4 years. I have some time for it to kind of shake out a little bit.
Yeah. And then with your, for your whole educational career, what challenges have you experienced, such as I feel like when we sometimes get to that college level, higher education level, it kind of negates Native perspectives and teachings and, kind of that other side. So, what's your experience has been like throughout your whole college career and professional career?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I might have to start a little back to sort of answer this kind of how I want to. But so one of the things coming to college was really both my undergraduate and my doctoral program was really unusual in my family. Neither one of my parents graduated from high school. My grandmother never learned how to read or write, partially because she was brought up in an era where her family was still afraid of boarding schools. And so the idea of sending your kid to school to read and write was a really scary thing. And so I think she went to school for a year or something like that. I found some paperwork one time that was she went to school until she was in first grade. And then her parents were they pulled the plug on it. And so that's sort of the way that I approach education, that I entered like an undergraduate degree at the college level, and then my doctoral education was with being sort of like an anomaly in my family. And one of the reasons that is the case too is because of in my own family, I know with a lot of Native folks, this family, there have been a lot of different manifestations of historical trauma. And so in my family, that's looked like alcoholism, that's looked like suicide, that's looked like sex trafficking. And so all of those things are barriers that my family have faced that they were basically trying to survive all of those things. So going to college wasn't really an option. And so me going to college was a very like radically different thing to do in my family. And so I found it both really exciting and liberating to be able to be in those spaces. And in some ways, it actually has taken me further away from my family because they don't have any kind of like idea about what those spaces are like. And so it's hard to talk about like what I do and what school is like with them. While I'm also trying to like stay connected to like who I am and where I come from, and, you know, also like learn new things and heal my own trauma that's embedded in my own life as a result of growing up in the family that I did. And so one of the other things, I think this is probably, I think I'm blending a lot of questions together, but one of the other things that feels important to share about this part of my journey is that as a result of my grandma and, you know, the generations that came before her, as a result of their experiences with racism and boarding schools and these really traumatizing events, my grandma essentially made a decision to raise any of her kids. So my mom and some of my aunties and uncles, any of her kids who could pass as white, she basically like raised them as white. She was like, don't be telling people you're an Indian. That's not a positive thing in her experience. And so my mother is a very white coding woman. And so she mostly walked around the world as a white woman throughout her whole life. And then thus passed that on to me and my siblings. And so the confusing thing that happened, of course, as a child, my grandma lived with us and my aunties and uncles were always around. And so I was being actively told that I should act as if I'm a white person and not be a Native person, even though I had all these Native family members like all around me all the time that were, you know, cultural like understandings of the world came through no matter what. So it made for a very confusing experience for me. And I didn't start working through a lot of that stuff until I reached adulthood. And a powerful experience for me when I started getting my undergraduate degree, which I got at Montana State University, was when I started taking Native American Studies classes. And I was learning things in those classes that helped me understand like what in the world had been going on in my family, because I had been getting all these mixed messages about like it's a shameful thing to be a Native person and it's better to be white. But then my grandma was like passing on these ideas of one of the like things that my tribe believes is that seeing owls will bring bad luck. So that's just a really concrete example. So my grandma would be like saying things like that at the same time. She's like, oh, but you're white. And so it made for a very confusing experience that by taking Native studies classes, I was able to start understanding like why my grandma had been ashamed and why she was making the decisions that she had made and why I only had like all of these bits and pieces of my like cultural practices to draw on. And so from that point, I was able to understand enough about what was going on to start to be more intentional, which I've, you know, been doing over the last decade or so, about like plugging back into some of our family members who still live on the res in North Dakota, and working to like heal these kinds of traumas and communicate with my family members about the things that have fractured like cultural practices in my family. And so one of the other things that happened going to school is because I was raised largely outside of my tribal traditions and culture, that I have been pretty easily like assimilated into higher education. So I've had a lot easier time than a lot of my Native relatives or friends who identify as Native that I have, who were more connected to their culture growing up and then coming to an institution of higher education. They often had a lot harder time than I had. So I always like to acknowledge that piece because it did afford me, certain privileges. But it came at a large expense too, that I've been actively like revitalizing the things that I felt like I never had a choice in belonging to until, the last decade of my life, when I could go back and try to stitch together things that had been broken by settler colonization.
Yeah, you brought up like a bunch of different topics, and I definitely connect with you on certain things. Being an urban native, like I feel like I've been totally like removed and not been connected to my tribe's culture as much, and I've only gotten like little bits of it, fragments, and so I've always had to go back and fall back on relatives and friends, and there may be native people here, but it's like still like they're of different tribes, so you can't really connect with them fully. So, and that's another aspect that I try and teach people, is that people want to put us underneath this umbrella, but we can't do that necessarily, because each tribe has their own ways and teachings and ways of being. So, but yeah, but you did bring up your grandmother's experience, with racism and social injustices and stuff, and we see that like in the media today, and obviously with events going on recently. um have you experienced any you know of these types of things throughout your lifetime, and living up in Montana and everything?
Definitely less than like my sister, for instance. My sister is like much more native presenting than I am. And so my sister has been asked like all these ridiculous questions her whole life that I haven't necessarily got, but I have had a lot of instances just throughout my life of things that I would label as like microaggressions. So for example, a very common question that I get from like that I've gotten over the course of my life from like friends or people I work with or whatever is like this question of like, how much native are you? And, as like without delving into like this whole explanation of blood quantum and how like my tribes don't like, they use blood quantum now, but that's not historically how they qualified belonging in our communities. And so without educating people on this whole big thing, it's hard to respond to that question. And it also really like it's very disruptive too, like for me personally as an individual, because then I feel like I'm put in a position where I have to explain my indigeneity. Like I have to explain being a Métis person. I have to explain being an Anishinaabe person. And nobody wants that for like their identity. Like nobody wants to be in a position where they have to like give an explanation of who they are. And so like that's one example. And then I did have a experience, like one of the most recent experiences I had was more recent, I guess, when I first moved to Missouri. I met with a couple people on campus here, and one of them was in this like diversity space on campus. And this person that I met, she was asking what kinds of things I was interested in and where I moved from. And so I was sharing with her about some of my interests around Native populations and all of that. And she responded by saying that there are no Native people in Missouri, so it's going to be really hard for me to do my work here. And I was like, okay, I immediately felt uncomfortable because, for multiple reasons, but one of the reasons was this person just told me that there are no Native people here. So it was hard for me to be like, well, how am I going to belong here then if I just take this person's word for it that Native people don't exist in Missouri? And then, of course, there's a bunch of other kinds of ways you could understand her comment. But that was another one. And then I have had a lot of experience over the course of my life with this this language that, again, like friends, colleagues, people who don't know me ask questions like what are you? Like I present like confusingly racially sometimes. And so a lot of people, especially non-Indigenous people and white people, think that that's an appropriate question to ask people. And so I sort of just file all of those under the category of microaggressions, because those are not very appropriate questions to just like randomly ask people that you don't know.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what another aspect I wanted to kind of show with people is like, you know, you may hear about certain issues going around in Indian country and stuff, but they may not understand that concept. And so sometimes hearing like, you know, what's kind of going on in different parts, you know, of the country and in those communities, like it differs. And I really wanted to kind of share like, you know, what are things that, you know, you might have experienced as, you know, through your lifetime. So can you share more about like your family, your grandparents and, you know, kind of like how they were, where they grew up, all that good stuff?
So okay, so I have two sort of different Native families in my family, two different like lines I'll sort of follow. So one of them are all Métis people. And so that side of my family comes from a lot of different parts of Canada, but mostly like what's currently known as Saskatchewan, a little bit of Manitoba. And so that part of my family was hanging out in that area for a long time. And my grandmother, she was born in what's currently known as Saskatchewan. And they also had relatives that are like across now what's like the Canadian border now in what's currently known as northern North Dakota. And so the official name of that other part of my family is the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians. But my family calls ourselves Anishinaabe. And so you have Métis and then you have Turtle Mountain Anishinaabe. And they, like my grandparents, my great grandparents and back, they spent a lot of their lives like going back and forth. Like they didn't acknowledge they were doing that long before a border was there, of course. And so I've like done a bunch of different research and have looked back where they have all of these like border crossings once there became a border and then like paperwork started getting attached to it. So I have all of these like really interesting moments where I've tried to, you know, I look at dates and I've tried to imagine like what they were doing going back and forth and why they were doing that. And so it's helped me construct ideas somewhat of the movement that my family was making for a lot of years before I was even born, of course. And one of the things that the border did too, for my grandma specifically, so like I shared, she was born in what's currently known as Saskatchewan, but they traveled back and forth a lot. And she grew up primarily on the Turtle Mountain Reservation. And for her whole life until she was like 50, she was technically an illegal citizen of the United States, since she was born in Canada, and she never like did any of that paperwork. She was an enrolled member of our tribe, the Turtle Mountain tribe, but she wasn't technically a US citizen. And so there were all these there's like funny stories that have been passed along, but one of my eldest auntie, when she was a teenager, her and my grandmother, I guess, used to get in arguments about whatever. And my auntie would tell my grandma that she was going to have her deported back to Canada. And so it was like always this like funny thing that was going on. But it really illuminates like some of the issues that the border caused in families like mine, because our tribal territories didn't recognize like a border between these countries because we had family on both sides of it. And we had been using those pathways for, millennia beforehand. And so, so that's one sort of piece of it. And then another sort of interesting thing that happened is my great grandfather, he he's no longer alive, but he was Turtle Mountain Anishinaabe, and he was married to a Métis woman from Canada. And so since she wasn't a member of the Turtle Mountain tribe, my grandmother was listed way on at least some early Dawes rolls as being like half Native person, even though her mother was a Native person, her father was a Native person, but whoever the Bureau of Indian Affairs agent was that was writing things down wrote my grandma down as half. And then later on, she was written down as different things. But I'm just sharing this because it's caused problems in my family as it goes down then for enrollment for all of the descendants, basically. And so that has been a confusing, just like paperwork thing to work through. And especially if people don't understand like how and why these roles where people's blood quantum was even being written down, that can be an issue, which it has been in my family for some of our members. And then outside of that, my grandma grew up on the Turtle Mountain res. And then at one point, her father and some of her aunties and uncles started migrating toward Montana. And so like the Little Shell Band of Chippewa are in Montana. And so that's part of, they used to be part of my tribe, the Turtle Mountain Anishinaabe. And so my family never officially sort of broke off with the Little Shell Band, but there was a migration of quite a few people from Turtle Mountain that made their way out to Montana. And so that's sort of that's why I was born there, is because they all sort of migrated in that direction at a certain point in time. And then would just go back and forth between Montana and North Dakota and Canada. And so that's been a really cool part of my journey over the last decade, is because I was never brought to North Dakota or Canada when I was a child. And so it's just been in the last 10 years since I've been an adult, then I've been able to meet a bunch of relatives in North Dakota and Canada that I had never met before. And a lot of them are really old. So I'm really grateful that I have gotten an opportunity to be able to spend time with them and all of that stuff. So,
you mentioned before how there was difficulties with, carrying on the culture, the traditions, things like that. So in what ways has the culture been brought into the family life, growing up and all that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll give a couple specific examples. So there was never, because of the sort of shame that came with it by the time like my siblings and I were born, there was never any really overt like cultural practices. So we didn't go to powwows. We didn't practice ceremonies. None of those things were brought into my family. The things that were brought in many ways are things like, I'm trying to think of ways to explain these, like dreams, for instance. Like my tribe really heavily believes in like the power of dreams as ways to communicate with all kinds of relations, past, present, future. And so my grandma brought those teachings like into my life very early and taught me a lot of like dream work, basically, from the ways that she understood it from her point of view that she learned from her mother and grandmother. And so that's one that came through like really clearly. And so I hold like great value, like cultural value, especially in like my own dreams and like my interpretations of like what it means to dream, both literally, like when I fall asleep at night, and translations of that into like what like future might look like dreaming of like possibilities for my own life. So that's one really specific thing. And then another one that I feel torn about, which I'm sure you'll get because of colonization, but like fry bread was always around my house. That was something that I have like lots of experiences of people cooking, and it like burns your eyes when it's being cooked inside because of the oil and the air. But that's of course very like markedly Native, like lots of people all over Indian country know and understand and have relationships with fry bread. So that was another thing that was brought in. And And then I would say the last thing that I would share is their the way I understand now how the tribes that I belong to practice like being in relationship with one another and practice like collective decision making and stuff like that. That was very present in my family, where we all were like taught and understood that we were like a family unit. And that wasn't to say that like individuality wasn't encouraged, of course, on some levels for us as individual people, but we were really brought up with the idea that like family is like the most important thing, and that like we have to be able to like be in relationship with one another and make decisions together for all of our well-being. And that was like a very important value in my family that I didn't necessarily see in like friends of mine's homes who were not Native. So that I would say is another, like, that I understand now as like a cultural value that was certainly passed on and that I was brought up with.
You say like you're learning and becoming more connected with dream interpretation and everything. And are there other things that like you're currently doing right now to kind of enhance your knowledge and connections to your tribe's culture?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for asking this. I love this question because this has been like probably one of the most exciting parts of all of this journey. I have been able to connect with different relatives, like in North Dakota, especially, where I have been able to learn different ceremonial practices that I was never introduced to until I was an adult. So like sweats are one. And then I've also been able to learn, not from my own family members, but other people in my tribe, bead weaving. And so like bead weaving was a really important part of Métis and Anishinaabe culture and continues to be important parts of those cultures. And so I've been able to learn both how to do it and like the cultural and medicinal significance of bead weaving. So that's another one. And then language too. My grandma, even though she was much more rooted in cultural practices in her life, she never spoke any of our ancestral languages. So the language was cut off even before her. But I have been spending probably only the last 2 years, and I'm certainly not fluent or anything, but I've been delving into both Michif and Anishinaabe Moin languages. And those have been one of the most powerful parts of this journey, because language is such a vehicle to reveal worldviews. And so I have been able to understand like values and knowledges and teachings that exist in my tribe through the language that I don't think I could access if I wasn't learning the language. So those have been some really exciting things that have been going on. And then right before the pandemic hit, I had plans to meet with some of my relatives in North Dakota who dance, who like ceremonially dance. And so that is hopefully one of the next things that I'll get to learn from my relatives about and see if that feels like a meaningful connection with my own life. But that one's on hold for now until the pandemic is over.
What's something that you could describe to a non-Indigenous person or someone that's not familiar with your tribe that kind of maybe like sticks out, if that makes sense?
Yes. So I do have something that came to mind. So I'll talk a little bit about this. It's both with Métis people and Turtle Mountain Anishinaabe, because one of the things that differentiates Turtle Mountain Anishinaabe from like Ojibwe or Anishinaabe people who live in the Great Lakes region is that as like that part of Anishinaabe people continue to move west and farther north and sort of landed in North Dakota in the Turtle Mountains, they developed their own cultural practices that are markedly different from Anishinaabe or Ojibwe people who live in the Great Lakes. And so one of the things that happened is that the Turtle Mountain area and Métis people to some extent have this sort of beautiful confluence of a bunch of different cultures. So Anishinaabe, Cree, and French are primarily the sort of cultures that have created this like really interesting bubble of like a new culture almost in that area. And so one of the things specifically that like Métis people are known for are fiddling and dancing that blend together. You'll get like steps from like a jingle dress dance, which is a traditional like Anishinaabe dance, along with like square dancing that will be blended into the same dance with like a fiddler playing. And so that's a really sort of unique one that I don't think any other tribes have, that kind of like dance or like blending of cultures that happen in especially in like a really fun, like energizing way that like music and dance of course bring. So I think that's one example. Another thing that I shared just a little while ago, and it's certainly, I don't think it's as unique to my tribes, but I mentioned before that like embroidered and beaded like floral patterns are really, that's sort of like a hallmark that you'll see on Anishinaabe and Métis like shirts or dresses, both like in regalia and traditional wear, as well as like contemporary fashion designs made by people from those tribal nations. So that's sort of like another one that isn't as active as dancing and music, but it is something else.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's a great explanation. And I was kind of curious about the fiddling part and the dances because another participant mentioned about that. And I didn't understand the concept, but you really described on those connections and how it kind of, they kind of can, I guess, one kind of developed off another and you have what it is today. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. It's the Métis flag has like what I think most people would call an infinity symbol that, it looks like the figure 8 on its side. And one of the reasons that symbol's on their flag is to represent like European cultures and indigenous cultures that were sort of blended together to form a new culture, like through Métis people. And so that is sort of another way to think about something like fiddling and these blending of like dances into like this new culture.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I didn't even know about that symbolism. So yeah, that's great. Yeah. Have you found it challenging? You kind of spoke about before, but I mean, do you still find it challenging to stay connected, like with the culture and especially like where you're at today and everything?
Yeah, it's definitely hard, especially being geographically where I am. And that would have been the case in Montana even too. There's a lot of times that I wish that I was living in North Dakota or Canada just to have more like time available to spend with my relatives than in like places that have been that my family has had relationships for a long time with. And so a lot of the connecting that the pandemic is sort of, a wild card for everybody, but even before the pandemic, I spent a lot of time like writing letters back and forth and talking on the phone, some Zoom stuff. But like I said, a lot of my relatives in those parts are pretty old. So digital technology isn't always available to communicate with them. And then as I meet even more people like in those communities, it has become easier to stay connected because now I have like an increased like relationship base with a lot more people who are in my tribes than I did before. And so it definitely would be easier if I was there. And it's definitely harder to not be in a community that has a bunch of Métis or Anishinaabe people in it because I feel sort of isolated as a result. But it's workable. It's not ideal, but it's workable.
What's the community, I guess, where you're at right now in Columbia? What's that kind of like for you? And then is it challenging and what kinds of things are kind of going on if there's other Indigenous people in the area
Yeah,
to kind of bring them together?
definitely. Yeah, that's a good question. So most of the community that I've built here in Columbia is through MU, and there is a Indigenous student group that I'm part of. And so I've been able to meet other Native students through that. And it's been cool too with that because there's like Ogallala Lakota, Pueblo of Isleta, Chickasaw. There's like a bunch of different kind kinds of people that are from tribes that aren't mine. And so we've been able to like learn a lot from each other's experiences and just hang out. So that's been really, really helpful because there's still, even though we're all from different tribes in different parts of the country, we still have a lot of the same understandings about like settler colonialism, for instance, or the challenges that can be, that can exist in like a university space when there's not very many Native people. And then the other thing is I think there's 6 Native faculty at Mizzou too. And that's been really one of the most crucial parts of my experience here. One of my mentors is a Cherokee scholar, and she's been just amazing at like supporting me and infusing everything. She was like brought up in Cherokee culture. And so she brings her whole self into all of her work. And so I have been really lucky to like be able to work with her and learn from her and see an example of what it looks like to be an Indigenous woman, like working as a professor at a predominantly white institution of higher education. And so all of those have been really amazing experiences to be able to have her as like a mentor and role model and stuff like that. And then there are a handful of other Native faculty that have been great too. And so between like the Native faculty and the Indigenous student group, we all sort of get together and we'll plan Native Heritage Month programming. We've done that the last few years all together. And we just got an Indigenous task force approved from the president of the university. And so all of us are on it since there's only like 12 Native people that we know about like at Mizzou. And so all of us are on this task force. And the thing that we're going to be looking at over the next year is essentially like surveying the climate of the Mizzou campus for like, how is it for Native students there? How is it for Native faculty? What do the non-Native students even know about Indigenous communities? So we're going to be doing work like that over the next year, which feels really exciting to continue to build community with the Native folks that are there and to hopefully be able to make some concrete changes for the better, hopefully, after the task force sort of does its work.
Oh, that's awesome. And actually, that's what's kind of burning back in my head. I was kind of wondering, like, from my own personal experience of how Mizzou is, like, I wouldn't expect like very many Indigenous people being there. So my expectation would be, there's probably just not enough things for Indigenous people in creating space for that population. So, you kind of explained a little bit of what you're doing. So is this relatively like new stuff that's kind of gone on? And, was that stuff like not there, like when you came to Mizzou?
Yeah, it's sort of both. So 4 Directions is the Indigenous student group, and they were founded, I think, in 1986. So they've been around for over 30 years. It seems like when we look back in our archives, the group was always pretty small. Like there was never like 50 people in the group or anything like that. But they've been doing this kind of work at Mizzou for a long time. Basically the whole time the group has existed, they've been doing this kind of work. But it's all been in such small steps because there hasn't been very many students. And it's hard, as I'm sure too, it's hard to like have, like upper administration pay attention to the issues that are important to us when there's just not very many of us. And so I think that's been kind of a constant struggle of the Indigenous student group. But what has been cool is it feels like it's been very intergenerational. So like programming like Native Heritage Month got started by like people that I don't even know that were in that group a long time ago. And then it's been picked up, as people come and go through Mizzou's, through their programs at Mizzou. So that's kind of cool because I feel like less alone in that. I feel like there's been all these other people who came before me that were going to the university that have put work in that have allowed me to continue building on the work that they already did. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is there have been, since there are a handful of Native faculty now too, we have been able to get more things done even. So we got like an Indigenous mural on our campus recently that was painted by an Osage, Muskogee Creek Cherokee muralist, and has a lot of different kinds of symbolism in it, and is drawing attention to the land that the university sits on as, being traditional homelands and waterways of Osages. And so stuff like that, that's very new, like to this campus and this university. There's been nothing like that done before. And so, like I said, there certainly has been work being done on this level at the university, but it feels like it's increasing. Like we're starting to gain some momentum around it, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, glad to hear that. Are all the students, Indigenous students at Mizzou, are you all like underneath like one program, or are you guys all, in various different programs?
Yeah, we're all over. There's like people in communications, in agriculture, in sociology, in interdisciplinary studies. So we're kind of all over the place. And we are also I'm a graduate student, and I think all of the other members right now are undergraduate students, but usually like every few years, there's like a blend of graduate students and undergraduates, just because again, there's not enough of either to like have two separate groups of graduate students and undergrads. So that's kind of cool too, that because that feels like intergenerational in some ways too, just on a really like zoomed in level.
Yeah, and have you all discussed any things like taking some of your whether it's your tribes or Indigenous culture and teachings in general, and implementing that into carrying that into the classrooms of their programs, such as like I was thinking of like, let's say land management type program, or something with, dealing with like plants or botany type things. Like I didn't know if, the other students have kind of spoke about, taking their culture and teachings and putting it into those types of spaces.
Yeah, definitely. Two things that I think of when you ask that. One is this Indigenous task force that we're all a part of. One of the things that the task force is going to be looking at across campus is our curriculum, like across all disciplines, and basically getting data about how more Indigenous knowledges can be incorporated into curriculum for all students, not just Indigenous students. Because, we have a very small Native American studies program that, those knowledges and texts are in those programs, but the task force that we're on is going to be looking at curriculum across the university is going to be making recommendations for how can Indigenous teachings exist in any discipline, and how might the university go about doing that. And then the second thing is, since I'm a graduate student, I also teach classes. I take classes and then teach classes too. And so next year, for instance, I'm developing a class for the Honors College. I don't have a name for it yet, but it's basically looking at what settler colonialism is and how it shows up in society today. And so that'll be a class that's available for any student in the Honors College to take from me. And so that's one way that like I personally am trying to bring in my own like cultural background and understandings into curriculum.
Yeah, that's awesome. So this will be like your first class that you'll ever teach too?
It will be at the college level. I used to be a high school English teacher in Montana before I started my doctoral program. And so I've taught like high school, like at the high school level, but never at the college level before. So that'll be the first time for that.
Oh, well, let's talk a little bit about that. Yeah. What was that experience like? Like what did you teach at high school, and, and yeah, how did you bring that into, your culture into that classroom?
Yeah. So that one, it was really, I had a great time teaching high school. I taught high school English in like a really rural town in Montana. And so my classes were really small. They were, I think the most students I ever had in a class was like 14, something like that. But some of them were as small as like 3 students. And one of the things that I did, one of the years I was teaching was the like 2016, 2017 year. And that was when everything with the Dakota Access Pipeline movement was really like gaining a lot of momentum. And that was also the last presidential election. So there was a lot of different things going on in the world at that point in time. And so I developed a unit that was essentially rooted in teaching my students how to understand what the water protectors at that location were doing. And I paired that with a novel called Wind from an Enemy Sky that was written by a native guy from Montana. And so that was like the actual book that I taught, since it was an English class. But I used the book to help the students understand what was going on at Standing Rock. And so that was sort of my way to like insert the ways that I was understanding the world into a high school class and share those understandings with the high school students that were in my class.
So was that class in that school, was there not very many Indigenous people like attending that school? Okay. All right.
No. Yeah, the whole school was white, basically. There was one Crow family. I didn't have any of the students like from that family in my classes, but other than their family, everybody in the community was white.
Yeah. And that's what I've discussed with many other participants here. And, some of them, they grew up here, or, they're actually teachers in the school systems in Missouri. And we would discuss that the awareness of Native peoples and issues and culture, it's just not there. And they have to, kind of take it upon themselves to create those types of, opportunities to teach them. So do you have anything, for like Missourians, who there's numerous people out there that aren't aware of Indigenous people and topics and issues and, all the above. Do you have anything that, you would suggest or, could teach them?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of different things I think I could offer, but one thing that feels really important is, in my time in Missouri the last couple of years, one thing I feel like I've seen a lot of are, it might be a museum that's hosting a workshop. It might be a bookstore that's hosting a book talk. It might, any of these types of spaces where learning is facilitated. And in so many of these instances, I feel like I have seen people talking about Osages, for instance, or the land that we're on. And the people teaching about it are never Indigenous people. And it feels so like such a missed opportunity to me, because there are Osage authors and there are people who work in museums who are Indigenous, and there are all of these resources that could be drawn on from Indian country. And it feels like that's being missed a lot of the time in Missouri. And of course there are, like, this is happening sometimes. So I don't want to, frame it like this never happens ever. But I would say that just like any person who is interested in learning about Native cultures or Indigenous knowledge or wants to read a book, like, seek out an Indigenous person and like buy it from them or pay them to give your workshop or whatever it is, because our communities have so much knowledge and so many amazing teachings that like ought to exist in the world too. And so I think I would say that as my final sort of takeaway.
That's awesome. Yeah, thanks. And that's why I always tell people too, because they ask, what's okay, what's right, can I attend a ceremony and stuff? And like what you just said, oftentimes the best thing to do is actually just interact with, Indigenous people, because they'll tell you, what's okay, what's not, tell you about the culture and everything. So thanks for participating in this and getting to know more about you. I was excited about having this interview.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It was a really awesome space to get to share, and I appreciate it.
And for the audience, we have other interviews going on with other Indigenous people. So please check those out, and we'll see you later. Thank you.